Meme machine, meme machine. I'm a motherfucking meme machine. Meme machine, meme machine. Without memes, I will die. Give me the memes. I need the memes. I smell the memes. I need all the memes to survive.
Welcome to One Dime Radio, hosted by me, One Dime, the YouTuber, and I am here with none other than Mike Watson, author of the book Can the Left Learn to Meme, and the newer book being released this September, The Meming of Mark Fisher. Dr. Mike Watson played a role in my video, Meme Warfare, which will be coming out at the same time as this interview. He oversaw the script and actually also makes an appearance, and some of the ideas in the video are derived from his analysis. Today we will be talking about memes and memes as propaganda, as well as various ideas from his books, which we have a lot to learn from. Would you like to introduce yourself, Mike, and what your work's about, as well as your YouTube channel that you do on the Acid Left?
Yeah, sure. Hi, thanks for having me on. I'm basically a media and art theorist. I'm mostly focused on the link between art, broadly culture and politics, and really the idea of a horizontal culture, basically being a culture where anyone can express themselves, anyone can have a platform, and the way in which the art world has been talking about horizontal culture for a long time, firstly via avant-garde art in the 19th and 20th centuries, and more recently in museum programming, where museums, government kind of culture departments, private art foundations, etc., talk about making art space programs aimed at involving the public as much as possible, and how so often that this doesn't really manifest, and actually art is very elitist, yet we do have this kind of platform of culture which is open to nearly everyone, which is the internet. So we do kind of have, a realization of the dream of a cultural expression for all, but it's not being used as we intended. So I look at that and what we should be doing with that. Of course, the contradiction being that one cannot say, yes, finally we have, democratic culture, so to speak, but it's not being done how we want, because, once you give the people the ability to say whatever they want, you can't then turn around and berate them for making cat memes, making selfies, Mark Fisher memes, for example, etc. So I'm looking at that kind of contradiction, and also the Frankfurt School and how we can interpret memes through the theory of Adorno, Benjamin, but not just how they would have seen them, but how we can use their work as a departure point for assessing the value of internet culture for good and bad.
Yeah, in your Can the Left Learn to Meme book, you seem to place a rather optimistic view of memes, and sort of looking through the lineage of art, how art was once very exclusive to bourgeois people, and sort of memes, while you can debatably call them art or not, I think you seem sort of on the fence about whether they are art. We can get into that. But now with digital culture, we all have access to we can create our cultural production. We can all do it. And with memes, like, this is good and bad, obviously, we get, in many ways, some memes with subversive pedagogical potential. But on the other ends, you just got like shit posts and stuff with no meaning. And in this new book, you talk about something called slow meming as sort of an alternative to the shit post. Can you tell us a bit about what that is?
Slow meming. I basically, in this book, which is called The Meming of Mark Fisher, How the Frankfurt School Foresaw Capitalist Realism and What to Do About It. So it is like really a book as much about the Frankfurt School and how they would view today's culture, and how Mark Fisher is very much indebted to the Frankfurt School, a point which is made quite clear in his last unfinished book, Acid Communism, the introduction of which is published by Repeater Books in their compendium of Mark Fisher essays and texts. It's made clear in that text that Fisher was very much thinking about the work of Adorno and Marcuse. In this book, I talk about how the internet is responsible for the co-optation of left-wing culture, and how it's basically impossible to have a cogent kind of debate on the internet, because the internet isn't really about putting forward ideas. It's about putting forward anything in terms of what will get people clicking. So it's not that the internet favors ideas which can be developed. It favors ideas basically which can be spread at the expense of a cogent development of ideas. So, often one can't actually have a logical discussion on the internet. It gets kind of distorted. So I use the example of Andrew Yang, who ran for the Democratic candidacy and more recently as New York mayor, but fell out of or dropped out of both races, and how his Democratic president candidacy was derailed as people kind of made jokes about the universal basic income he was offering of I think it was $1,000 a month. And they kind of made these memes where people were using it to buy alcohol and drugs. And these memes sometimes involved very right-wing imagery, because I think a lot of kind of people who memed Donald Trump and other kind of alt-right kind of signifiers migrated into the Yang campaign to derail it, or actually because they started to favor Yang over Trump because they could get this money, So it's kind of a joke, but maybe some of them were actually serious. But anyway, the point is that Yang kind of used that to some degree, or his campaign, but really kind of derailed his message. So it was just an example of how you can't often put out a message hoping it to have a certain impact. It gets distorted. And that's just very much in line with the fact that one has to make kind of very quick, impactful statements on the internet, and you can't really control how they're going to be skewed once they're out there. And what we need to do basically to stop that happening, so we can again have a cogent discussion, because all this kind of favors the right, even if the right can't actually peddle a specific message, because it just kind of derails the left and is only useful for the data economy. So how we might get around that is to use the internet's vast resources, which are a brilliant thing, and to basically try and slow them down. There's nothing to stop us using the internet at a slower pace and having kind of more developed discussions. I'm not talking about debate bro style YouTube discussions, though they also kind of work, to some degree. But, just a way of saying, okay, we have all this stuff. It's amazing in consideration of what we had 20 or even 10 years ago. If someone talks about Adorno, you can probably find his major works in PDF, immediately, or whoever. So that has to be a good thing. And I can tell you it's a good thing, because in the late 90s, you couldn't basically find Adorno sometimes in your own university library, and certainly not in your local town library. So that's really kind of increased the availability of critical theory to people. But we need to then go with that. Okay, let's slow down and use it differently. Let's also, produce stuff and put it out there, but not just with a view to having a very quick kind of laugh out of somebody, or just having a very quick impact on someone, but with a view to some kind of process of aesthetic reflection. So we could make memes that are actually supposed to be consumed more slowly and can lead people away from hopping from one meme or video to another. So that's basically the concept of the slow meme. I don't know how exactly it would happen. I mean, I've been kind of toying with this. I think acid communist memes of vaporwave kind of indicate how this could happen, in the sense that vaporwave music is abstract and it's something you can kind of spend time with, and it kind of leads you in a kind of floating, it kind of leads you that kind of sensation of a suspension of the normal kind of shall we say false boundaries of capitalism, the kind of normal false rationality. You can kind of get lost in vaporwave in the way you might get lost actually in Schomburg or Mahler or abstract painting or something. And I think that being lost is what can maybe help us drift away from this need to be constantly plugged in, which I think relates very much to capitalism and numerical counts and making money and stuff.
Yeah, you mentioned one thing there, a couple of things I wanted to touch on, but there's about Adorno and kind of how absurdist art in a rational society has the irrational power of subverting what we perceive as reality. And it kind of can sort of break our boundaries that we have towards this reality. And I found that kind of interesting. He calls it the shutter effect. You mentioned that in your Millennial Adorno essay as well. in which you say the millennial generation and the Zoomer generation are Adornian generations. But what does Adorno really mean by the shutter effect? Because I can kind of, on one sense, see with some forms of art, like film, for example, or really good documentaries or videos kind of having this, have like this artistic flavor to them that give you this shudder. In some ways, I think Adam Curtis documentaries, for all the maybe political qualms I have with them, Adam Curtis has a bit of the shudder effect in his films because it's perfectly matched. Like hypernormalization is a perfect example. It has perfectly matched music with footage. It really kind of, I don't know, it gives you goosebumps. And that's the way I experienced the shutter effect. But what was Adorno talking about? Was he talking about art and like as in paintings, as in films, music? I think music. But what was he referring to? Because I have a hard time understanding it from that point, because I'm obviously less immersed in the art, in the visual arts than you are.
Yeah. Okay. Well, when Adorno spoke about the shudder, he was basically addressing a fault in human thinking. Or just basically the only way by which human thinking can proceed, which is what he calls identity thinking, describing the fact that we relate to the world by identifying it, by giving things names, by measuring things, and that's basically how we control nature and the world around us, and actually other people. So it's a split between subject and object, the same as you often find in psychology, that we individuals, what we call the I, are very fearful of the outside object, okay, what we call, nature or you, or basically everything outside the individual I. So we proceed by trying to control nature and other people to kind of ward off the fear of death. Now, this is problematic because it results in systems of control within communities, within friendship groups, within families, within societies. It can lead to conflict. It does lead to conflict perpetually. But also the other thing is that the nature we're trying to combat is actually in us. We are part of nature anyway. So it's a full split, which you see in religion. Adorno says you see in religion, mythic thinking, magic. So these are kind of progressions from magic rites to mythic thinking to religious thought onto science and capitalism. Because these are false systems that basically hide the fact that we are nature anyway, they all kind of turn in on themselves, or rather the individual's attempt to control nature turns in on itself. So you end up controlling yourself via religion, because you end up becoming obsessed by the religious rites that you've kind of construed to control nature. Or through capitalism, you get a similar thing happening. So what Adorno says is that we can only really think outside this false identity thinking by stopping identifying. And that can only happen when we can't see something discernible. We can't say, like, this is an apple, a tree, this measures 1 meter, etc. So he says abstract art, because you can't see what it is, particularly if it's very new, so you haven't had time to like discern it and go, okay, that's a Jackson Pollock, although he was talking mostly about music and literature. But abstract art, because you can't like categorize it and identify it, can lead you temporarily out of this false system of identification. So he basically says that whilst you're listening to, for example, Schomburg or Mahler, or you're reading Edgar Allan Poe or Franz Kafka, or you're looking at the plays of Samuel Beckett, there's a moment in which you kind of get temporarily lost, absorbed in the artwork. Okay, so I think for us, maybe it's easy to think of some techno music, maybe ambient music like the Orb or Orbital, Pink Floyd, or also if you know classical, then Mahler. And the way when you're listening to it, you get kind of temporarily lost. You're no longer thinking about your phone that's about to go off, or checking your email, or what you're doing tomorrow, or politics. You're no longer categorizing things, and you're no longer thinking this is X, Y, Z. You're no longer thinking, if you're listening to Britney Spears, you're probably thinking something relating to the lyrics. So that's a form of categorization and identification. But you're not thinking anything specific, and you're not able to really put your finger on what's happening with the music. So you kind of lose your false boundaries between yourself and nature temporarily. But that can't last long. Okay. So Adorno says at some point you return back into yourself. And I think what's useful there is thinking about if you're looking at abstract art or actually any kind of, I suppose, good painting in a museum, and you get that moment when you get kind of lost, you forget like the gallery assistant, you forget the people around you, forget the crowds. You have a similar experience, but at some point, because you tend to get crowds in state museums, you're going to get somebody brush against you or talk loudly, or the museum assistant asks you to move away from the painting, and you're snapped out of that moment of being lost in the artwork, and you return back into yourself. That's the actual moment of shudder, is returning back into yourself and realizing that you've lost something, and realizing that returning into yourself is the false condition. You're returning to the false separation between yourself and the object. So immediately it's a kind of loss of what you would otherwise have, but it's exemplary of what we could have if we could stop thinking in terms of this conflict between ourselves and the outside or nature.
Yeah, there's something I actually want to use that point you just made to kind of push back on what you said about Andrew Yang memes. But before that, just for the audience, one thing I find useful for understanding Adorno and identity thinking for me was the essay. It's an against epistemology, and there's particularly, I think it's a chapter or a subheader, but it's called The Tyranny of Identity, which like lays it out very well. It helped me understand it. But I find Adorno to be somewhat of a Nietzschean in the sense that he kind of sees like a parallel between the Christian theocratic way of categorizing things, this dominance over nature, with the Enlightenment thinking and the idea of that we can know everything and we can scientifically put everything in categorize everything and put words on to define things. And like in that regard, he thinks that we still are kind of in the same problem, which is, I would say in many ways, this is like a proto-postmodernist critique in the sense that it sort of questions a lot of the Enlightenment assumptions and sees actually a lot of things in common with the Enlightenment and with pre-Enlightenment, like the problems that still exist that just kind of were secularized, to put it that way. And I think that Nietzsche is in this way a proto-postmodernist, and we later got people like Lyotard, Foucault, who kind of really question stuff like this. But would you say Adorno is like a proto-postmodernist? Because I want to ask that, because that's maybe a difficult question and a debatable question before I get into how I think really what you said before about the shudder effect might apply to Yang memes. But first, I want to kind of get your thoughts on that. Like, is Adorno sort of in that postmodern lineage?
Yeah, I think he is very much a precursor to postmodernism. I think the time that elapses from his last unfinished work, Aesthetic Theory, which he was writing in 1969 when he died, and the advent of like theoretical postmodernism is very brief. In fact, they may overlap. I don't know. You tell me, because I don't know what would be considered the first really postmodern work.
I think
they must overlap. Yeah,
Genealogy of Morality for me. I don't know. I'm sure there's something before that, but I think like Nietzsche, Beyond Good and Evil, and Genealogy of Morality are sort of proto-postmodernist.
Oh yeah, okay, but in terms of what people would normally call like postmodern, being something from the, I guess, starting in the 60s, 70s.
Oh, so yeah. Well, I mean, there's two strands of postmodernism in this, I guess, is like, I mean, we can talk about postmodernism as a epoch, which is like obviously kind of a lot of people think started in the 60s, some in the 80s, or like postmodernism as sort of a break from modernist assumptions. Whereas that's where I see like the postmodernist as cultural theory, as a societal condition. That's more Jameson, Mark Fisher, Lyotard and Baudrillard as well. But as theory, I think Foucault embodies that, because Foucault like totally deconstructed.
Okay, but Foucault would have overlapped Adorno at some point, no?
That's what I mean. Yeah, is I think that Foucault is sort of a disciple. He attributes his own work to Nietzsche, and I think Adorno is also a kind of, in many ways, in line with what Nietzsche was doing.
Yeah, I mean, I have a feeling that a lot of I don't really know to what degree they corresponded, the postmodernist. I don't even know when they started to call themselves even if they called themselves postmodernists. Maybe it's stuff I should know.
I don't think they did.
This kind of emerged later on. Yeah, I don't know to what degree there was correspondence or there was even agreement between these early postmodernists who would have been like part of the uprisings in Paris in '68 and the Frankfurt School, because of course Adorno in '69 was against his students who were uprising. The uprisings were very much kind of reflective or a continuation of what happened in '68 across Europe, and which most famously we know as occurring in Paris. So you would think that Adorno may have been seen as this very reactionary figure by what became the postmodernists, I would guess. But I still think all the same, his kind of dislike of what Lyotard would call meta-narratives, this kind of incredulity towards meta-narratives, is very present in Adorno, who won't even support, a strong opposition to capitalism called something like communism or whatever. He's kind of reticent because he kind of thinks that everything will revert back into barbarity potentially, because he's so concerned about the barbarity that emerged out of fascism. But also, I think there was an awareness of what had been going on in Soviet Russia. In fact, there was an awareness. So for Adorno, who was a German Jew who had been exiled during the war, who'd come back a few years after World War II to Germany to rebuild, he was very conscious of not reverting back into the horrors of World War II and totalitarianism in general. So he wasn't able to say like this will work, that will work. I mean, he had a huge amount of doubt towards any kind of program, basically. So I think that definitely fits in with postmodernism.
Yeah, the way I feel about Adorno is I kind of is the way I feel a lot about with postmodernists in general, or even whatever, regardless if one wants to call them a postmodernist, but theorists labeled in that milieu, is that they're really good skeptics. And I can't really say that they're wrong, but there's something really frustrating about them in that they don't propose any alternatives and kind of give like no way out, especially Adorno. I mean, didn't support obviously the '68 protests. He called the cops on them. He seemed like a party pooper, but back to this idea about dominance over nature and categorizing. I think there is like an element of truth to that, but I really find it hard to imagine how it's really possible to avoid that entirely. Because I think to some extent you do need to kind of have some kind of control over nature to an extent. Like, I mean, modern agriculture was that to a large extent. That's kind of what raised the human population so much. And the Industrial Revolution. The nature at the end of the day kind of doesn't really care about us. I mean, it'll get rid of us if it wants to. But I see, like, how do we not control nature? I feel this is where I side more with the Marxists, in that I think, okay, things aren't going to be perfect, but for like this survival of humans, to what extent is?
Yeah, I don't think Adorno is coming from something that's achievable. I think it's just coming from trying to avoid returning back into the situation that he lived through. That he had escaped from, trying to revert back into the conditions of the Holocaust, basically. So
would you say his bourgeois background kind of played also a role
in my next book? I definitely talk about that and to what degree the Frankfurt School itself and the continued popularity of the Frankfurt School is a result of the bourgeois class trying to maintain stasis rather than have a revolution, because the bourgeois class have a lot to lose, and potentially more to lose than the other two social classes. So I do talk about that, but I talk about how whether that is a fairly rational response, and that every class will respond in their own way to the conditions of capitalism. But he's kind of thinking about, he doesn't want to go along with anything that could be a false promise. So he basically won't say, hey, let's have a revolution, because he thinks that could revert back into its opposite. So he basically goes down the only channel which is left, which is art, because art can feign a removal from capitalism, in a society which he thinks is absolutely capitalist. So he's already saying, like, there is no alternative. This term that Fisher used, which actually comes down from Margaret Thatcher. Adorno's already saying that, and he really believes that there is no alternative. But then he's saying that there is this thing, art, which can basically co-opt capitalism. So what capitalist objects do is they create some kind of aura around themselves, which gives them properties in excess of their actual material properties. So they start to control humans. So the kind of the white shirt, which will make you more attractive to people, the trainers, which will make you more sporty, whatever. Adorno basically says that the artwork does that, but to a greater degree, by saying that it's autonomous from the system itself. So an artwork kind of claims to be outside reality, and to have a kind of aura which is semi-spiritual. And Adorno is basically saying that what happens when you're looking at an artwork and you become lost in it, and you suddenly snap out of that, and you have this shudder, is a shudder of the realization, because of the kind of the great contrast between this kind of suspension of your senses you were experiencing temporarily, this quasi-transcendental loss in the artwork, because of the contrast between that and the return back into yourself when you realize the artwork is only made of, for example, canvas and oil and pigment, etc. You suddenly realize the true conditions of the artwork being labored by human hands, and human hands working on natural materials, wood, cotton, pigment, oil, etc. With music, it's much the same. And actually, he was talking about music more. But with music, you get the same thing, because if you're in a concert hall and you're kind of getting lost in a Schomburg, and then at some point you snap out of that and you see the musicians who are basically laborers. You don't think literally they're laborers, but they are. You're kind of aware of that. And the instruments, which are made of wood and metal, etc. You return to the material conditions of labor, human hands working on natural elements that have always been there, and to our linkedness with nature, but also the kind of perpetual false condition of our separation from that nature as well. So this is, having forgotten why you asked me this, but I think that kind of explains it. This is what Adorno is talking about happening. And this is what, as you're going to ask me this, could also kind of happen with memes, I think. But the thing with memes is and with these, for example, the Yang campaign, they happen so quickly that I don't know that we're often led into this moment of like dreamy loss of a kind of transcendentalism, where we're kind of suspended somehow, like you might have if you're smoking weed and you're listening to Pink Floyd, which I haven't done since I was a teenager, or not both of those things at once. But
it's the only way to listen to Pink Floyd.
Sorry?
It's the best way to listen to Pink Floyd.
Yeah, I think so. Probably. I don't do hardly anything anymore in terms of like substances, but it is good if I recall. But the point is that this kind of moment of suspension, I don't think one is getting it very much off the internet. I think you're getting more of a brick wall. So you're getting less of like a floating away with the music or artwork, and you're getting more of something that immediately sends you back on yourself. So what Adorno's looking at is you look at an artwork, you get lost, and then you suddenly get snapped back into yourself, and then you realize the real conditions of human labor. With looking at memes and basically the internet in general, where you have image after image after image, and most of which are very cynical, I think we have a constant rebounding back on ourselves. So it's like a cycle of cynicism, where you look at something, you hope to get something from it, and you don't really, and you return back to you. And I think that what can happen through that eventually is something might snap, and you may, through just a kind of anger, depression, or anxiety, the kind of which Fisher talks about capitalism inducing, that you may kind of start looking for answers elsewhere, that you might get fed up with a whole damn thing and then start to embrace Marxism or something. So I think the process is actually quite different. I don't think we should be looking at really, not because you asked me, but just because I think generally people try and do this. We shouldn't be looking towards how Adorno could be applied today in terms of like, the meme is the new Schomburg musical piece, or the new Kafka story. we should be, I think, more applying his method of how he thought it was valuable to examine art and also popular culture and see what's emerging today and how those things today might be able to help the left. But I think it's very unlikely they're going to be helping the left in the same way.
Maybe we need more shudder effects.
Or we need the shudder happening through memes. We need to be making different memes. So it goes back to these slow memes. But I think to have anything like a slow meme, we need to change our relationship with the internet. So we'd have to make a concerted effort amongst us, for example, us online leftists who have podcasts and what have you, to maybe use certain platforms to maybe change our internet habits and to start distributing among us slower kind of artworks.
So yeah, I was actually going to get into memes, but before that, I noticed a bit of a big contradiction with Adorno's writings. So to what extent in how Adorno feels, so you know how Adorno, he describes a lot of these kind of bourgeois art is what he describes as having this shudder effect, like things like Kafka or listening to Mozart or stuff like that. To what extent does one really have to be from a certain background or have what could one call cultural capital to appreciate that sort of thing? Like maybe one has to kind of be accustomed to that thing to even appreciate the artistic beauty of it. Because in Adorno's culture industry writings, he also says something that I think is in direct conflict with this, because in the culture industry, he has a passage which I actually cite in my video about hip hop coming up 2 videos from now, where Adorno says people who are so used to the culture industry products, like culture industry standardized music, they get to a point where they have this regression of listening where they can't appreciate what he thinks is like serious music, good music. And like, for example, he describes about how people who are used to like pop hits will find classical music boring. Yeah. Doesn't that kind of conflict with the whole shudder effect? Because if people are so dumbed down by as he would think anyway, I think his views can be a bit elitist, but if people are so accustomed to standardization, I think the shudder effect's still possible, but maybe it's just with different things. I think it's the way he's applying the shudder effect is very narrow to a certain kind of art. Yeah,
I mean, we kind of covered that maybe before in the terms of saying that we don't have to look for things that directly map onto Adorno's theory, but more using the way he analyzed popular culture and high culture and looking for what in our culture might not perhaps create a shudder effect, but might throw people onto a leftist framework or a different way of thinking. So again, memes are generally highly cynical and we don't get much from them. So you have like Mark Fisher memes that don't generally make you think very much about Mark Fisher. They more make you think about how Mark Fisher's been co-opted by the capitalist system, i.e. the kind of social media algorithm, so that, you know, people are making very kind of crass, stupid memes about him and his theory because that's the way to get noticed. But that feeds directly into what he said about music and art being co-opted by capitalism. So he talks about Kurt Cobain, for example, in Capitalist Realism. So I think when we look at that, we kind of get disappointed, and actually people get very angry with that kind of thing. And I think the thing is that won't create a shudder, but it might eventually make something snap in us, and it might make us willing to then go out and create the real conditions for revolution. So it's not really what Adorno was talking about. But what Adorno was talking about, I think, is possible. If you look at, I cannot think of an example right now, but there are so many examples that people will be able to think of films that are kind of sentimental, of artworks or documentaries that are kind of, that have a kind of ambient feel, that have at least passages, where you do get that kind of quasi-transcendental experience. I think it's still possible that somebody could be in a movie theater. Of course, that's increasingly rare, but at a music concert, where they feel kind of somehow temporarily transported, and then they lose that moment of transportation and return back into themselves and realize suddenly like the falseness of their normal conditions. That is surely still possible. I think it's maybe increasingly not possible because increasingly impossible, because if we're not actually looking at our phones whilst we're at a concert, we're thinking about our phones. We're thinking about looking at our phones when we finish the concert. So the very existence of social media and smartphones makes this experience less and less possible. But that's where I think we have to slow down a bit the process, because it's not like the internet in itself makes this experience possible. It's a certain use of the internet where the internet itself has been co-opted by capitalism. So, as for whether Adorno's experience is elitist, well, yes, but the internet does make a situation where we could potentially make abstract art that could induce the shudder and spread it over the internet. It's just, would anyone really sit down and block out all other stimuli long enough to get that sensation from the internet? I mean, it could happen, but we think we have to kind of educate each other and encourage each other to use the internet in that way. I'm not very good at it, so I can't imagine that other people are. But then, talking about whether people are liable to go to a concert or even have the sensibility to spend time with a piece of music or art to get that kind of sensation of shudder, I mean, a great many people aren't. But does that mean Adorno's wrong for saying that's where that experience is located? Because what he's talking about is
I don't think he's wrong. I just think his examples are just kind of outdated.
Well, they're outdated. Yes, that's interesting. But also bear in mind that when he's talking about Schomburg, maybe it's better to use the example of Edgar Allan Poe and Beethoven.
Beethoven. I remember
they weren't contemporary. He talks about Beethoven in a chapter called, I think it's Society, that chapter and he
talks about in the culture industry too.
In aesthetic theory. Yeah, in aesthetic theory, he talks about it directly in relation to the shudder. And you're like, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony is not new, because Adorno also says elsewhere in aesthetic theory, you need the experience of the new to create shudder. But when I read it kind of closely throughout my PhD thesis, I kind of thought, well, hang on. What he's really saying perhaps is that it's a shudder that creates the new, not the new that creates the shudder. It's a kind of moment of dissonance in music or abstraction that shocks you out of your normal complacency, and you're kind of going along with the false conditions of capitalism. It's this moment that creates the conditions of the new, that is of a vibrant moment of living. It's that creates the new, not the new that necessarily creates the shudder. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, and
so in that case, we, sorry to interrupt, but we could recuperate Beethoven and put him on the internet, and maybe many people could have that experience because they could experience Beethoven where they otherwise couldn't. But having said that, I'm not saying I think that this happens very well through Beethoven. That's Adorno. I think there are things that happen that we could kind of spread around the internet, that if people were kind of encouraged to sit down with them in certain ambience, could maybe get the shudder off their smartphone or off their computer. But I think we'd have to do a lot more research into how do we kind of engineer an art that can create a shudder through the internet. I think that's the thing that I'm not saying I've really found it very much.
So I don't think Adorno is wrong at all with the shudder. The one thing I would just add is that I think it's very relative and different for each person. It can be slow, or it can be like very speedy. Like I can think of many examples of things that are shudder effect for me. So like you mentioned vaporwave earlier. I think Soviet wave has like this effect. There's a couple of songs in particular. I can maybe link one in the description, one of my favorites. But I think Soviet wave had kind of a certain role to play in popularizing like the resurgence of people to look into Marxism, Leninism, or just history in general. Like people have, you can argue whether like maybe one disagrees with this, but I think it plays a role in why a lot of people have more sympathies for the Soviet Union than they used to have, is like this kind of iconography. Like, I don't know if you're aware, but there's like this whole trend of Soviet wave, but also having like the vaporwave aesthetics of just this people living in the Soviet Union, just walking around. It's a popular thing.
I mean, the only thing with that is that Adorno would say that plays back into identification, because you can see stuff happening because it's directly political. So you're not getting.
This is where I disagree with him a lot. Is that I think being over, because I know he has that line where he says overtly political art is the least. Sorry, he said the most revolutionary art is the least political art. I don't know if I agree with that. And I know he has a lot of qualms with Soviet realism. I have qualms with the Soviet Union kind of deterring other art except Soviet realism. Like, I think that was a totalitarian act. But I don't think there was something wrong with Soviet realist art in the way he does. Like, he thought Soviet realist art was like this effort to kind of, it was instrumental reason. Like, it was art with a purpose. But I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think that's just another expression. I think it can be really powerful for people. Like, I'll give you back to the Soviet wave thing. Is there's a couple of anthems of the Soviet Union with vaporwave remix or synthwave remix, and I kind of, some of them give you like real goosebumps. Or it doesn't even have to be vaporwave. It can be all kind of music propaganda, so to speak. Like, there's a couple of versions of it, but there's the Che Guevara song that's very, very popular. It's about Che Guevara, and it's in Spanish, but it's a song that, I don't know, it gives you goosebumps and it makes you really like want to look into this history. I think there is that shudder effect, and I don't know how to really, I think you experience it in many different ways. So like, these are the ways I experience it. But you mentioned Andrew Yang before, and I think maybe dismissed it too much, because I actually think the Andrew Yang memes is like one of the reasons why he did so well in the first place, because he was like, no one knew who he was. He's never been in politics. He was taken as a complete joke, but he had a lot of support on the internet. And I think these memes, which might seem a little stupid, like the money printing memes, or like the everyone gets $1,000 memes, I think that was absurdist, because it really normalized something that, or to an extent, normalized something that was considered absurd, which shouldn't be absurd. Like the idea that everyone should get free money, like a basic income. In America, at least, that's a totally absurd. Like people would say, like, free money, what do you mean? Like in this, Protestant work ethic country, it's totally absurd. But I think the intentional absurdity of just Andrew Yang there with a money printer, just giving people free money, people buying whatever they want with it, I think that sort of, to an extent, normalized his idea. And I don't really like, Andrew Yang wasn't my favorite candidate by any means, but I think this is one of the good things about his campaign. And obviously he didn't play a big role in the meme himself. Like, it's really bottom up. It was just his supporters, some who used to be, as you mentioned, ex-Trump supporters, which I think that's a sign, that's a good thing, is the fact that he got some Trump supporters, and kind of like, I think to an extent, normalize this idea of a basic income. So for us, or for some people, it just might be kind of stupid, but I think for other people, maybe those Yang memes did have like this absurdist effect of breaking their preconceptions.
It definitely, it may have got him. Well, it definitely made him more known and more popular, but it wasn't really taken in the spirit that he intended. So, I mean, I'm not saying there was no positive outcome for Yang in that respect. He still had to drop out of the race, but he would have had to anyway. But he's a great deal more famous now because of that. But what I really mean to say in that passage in the book that's forthcoming in September about Fisher and the Frankfurt School is that one can't really program a kind of cogent discourse through the internet. You don't know what will come out. It's not that positive things won't come out. It's like right now, this is very current. Marxists is trending in relation to the England football team, because the England football team take the knee in support of Black Lives Matter before matches. And also Harry Kane wore a rainbow-coloured, kind of pro-LGBTQ armband in the last 16 match, the previous match. And also the Gareth Southgate wrote a kind of essay-length article in support of Black Lives Matter and taking the knee just before the tournament started. This is the England manager. So this is something incredible that this is happening, with the England team, because they've always been associated, with slightly kind of lad kind of culture, slightly kind of macho culture, which in England means, a little bit bigoted. But of course, this isn't Marxism. But the thing is that there have been prominent politicians like Nigel Farage that have called the England team Marxist for this reason. Priti Patel, the Home Secretary in England, won't support, or said she didn't like the fact that that England are taking the knee, and a politician called Lee Anderson from the Tory party in England, a member of Parliament, said he won't support the team for this reason. So this is kind of all crazy, but it's been kind of flipped round. A lot of leftists are now writing on Twitter. There's over 10,000 tweets, probably moving towards 15,000 by now today, which kind of joke that have an English team kind of improved since they adopted Marxism. So it's kind of funny. But the thing is, of course, this isn't at all a Marxist discourse. It's kind of people reacting against people distorting what Marxism means, i.e. people kind of using this cultural Marxist term to disregard identity politics, but then to conflate that with Marxism. It's taking that and kind of turning that on its head, saying, well, hey, look, the Marxists are doing really well now. They've improved at football. But no one is actually talking about what Marxism really means, which is unfortunate. But it still remains that if you were a street campaigner selling socialist newspapers, for example, or you went out with a stall campaigning, talking about socialism or Marxism, people still do this kind of thing. You could engage the public and say, well, hey, have you seen this debate about, or, this thing about people calling England team Marxist? What do you think about that? And that could lead you on to then talking about what Marxism really is. So you do get these weird openings that happen randomly. So the thing with the internet is because it's not really about getting people to click based on what they like or don't like, or based on following some kind of progression, like, ABC, I'm trying to learn something, or rather 1, 2, 3, going through a process of discovering something, because it's more about just getting people to click full stop. And it's probably easier for the companies to do that by just kind of getting people emoted, getting people angry about something. You're actually getting a situation where, you're no more getting moderate politics turn up than you are getting extremist politics turn up. But there's no knowing when either will turn up. So I think the thing is there, we can seize upon moments upon which these things turn up, the mention of Marxism online, and try and use that. But the thing is, really, ultimately, we're going to do a lot better if we can slow down this whole process and get people to follow through cogent thought processes again. So I would suggest that we use the internet to get people going onto the streets post-lockdown, into workplaces, in their own workplaces even, and talking to people, and we could coordinate that through the internet. We could have forums that are a bit like the ones used on the Labour campaign in the UK and the Sanders campaign, and we could be like going, okay, let's have a happening kind of pro-leftist art happening in Brighton in the UK tomorrow at the same time as one is happening in New York. But also let's have someone go and speak to those old people who have problems with paying their heating bills in France. We could be coordinating things on multiple levels all the time that are aimed at having real discussions in real life, rather than basically having to tag our theories on to memes that misrepresent Marxism.
How I feel about memes is that they can kind of be gateway drugs. They don't necessarily transfer ideology directly, but they can kind of, in many ways, often they have the most appeal with people who already kind of agree to an extent or are open to what that message is. But in some cases, they can kind of implant seeds. So, for example, these tanky memes, for some people might have a problem with them. Some are less cringe than others. But I think I'll give an example of one of the good tanky memes that I think is pretty good. Is there's the Castro meme, like the Chad Virgin meme, where they show Castro looking like a Chad, and they show a capitalist, and the capitalist says, "So you're just going to take all my slaves and property?" And Castro's like, "Yes." So I think that's the kind of stuff. What it does is it kind of normalizes stuff, and it's really straightforward. I think it has a certain level of efficacy.
Yeah, but
regarding a meme starting kind of political movements, I mean, wouldn't that kind of contradict what Adorno is saying, which is something I really disagree with, that the least political art has the most political potential? Because
it does contradict that, yeah. But I'm not really saying they would start political movements, or maybe you're not saying that I'm saying that, but I don't think they necessarily would. What Adorno would say is that we need much more theoretical reflection before we go acting, and I think that's true. But I think we also need to speak to actual workers, and not amongst academics and left tube people. So I think we could, rather than kind of relying on those occasional moments of a good left meme, maybe inspiring somebody or leading someone to pick up some left-wing theoretical text, and also to join local grassroots activist groups. Rather than relying on occasionally people doing those things on the back of a meme they saw, we could be using the internet to organize constant kind of reading groups, support groups, art happenings, concerts, etc. As in, what Fisher referred to in the Acid Communist introduction, we need a counterculture. So yeah, I mean, that's not really
and also
relying on figurative meme making that Adorno would hate. Is so much as trying to get away from that.
Well, and also memes, and I would say kind of cultural production in general, it can kind of allow get other people to also spread the same stuff. And you often look at like right-wingers throughout history, they often describe Marxism, which they use to describe all leftism, as a kind of cancer, like a virus. And I think they say that because, like sometimes when you have like this consciousness that raises class consciousness, whatever you want to call it, it can just spread because other people they want to also spread that idea. So how I see with memes, it's like it's horizontal as cultures. Sometimes you can get more and more radicalized just on the internet. I'm not saying that was my experience, but this is the experience of a lot of people. Like I mentioned in the meme warfare video that a lot of people got radicalized by the Bernie Sanders campaign. And also, weirdly enough, Andrew Yang meme groups, not the Andrew Yang campaign necessarily, but there's a lot of meme groups in which people get radicalized in. I'm in a lot of meme groups, not so much those ones, but I was in the Ocasio-Cortez meme group. And Ocasio-Cortez, despite having like very moderate kind of social democratic views, there was a lot of like anarchists, a lot of Marxists, all kind of different people in her groups who were like just bombarding. But I thought some of them were really good memes. And a lot of those people became like pretty far left. I mean, there's some pretty actually prominent leftists. Like, I'm not saying we should take them seriously, but just like people on Twitter who have like followings who are kind of like Marxist-Leninists. Like there's this guy called Comrade Waluigi or Luigi, something like that. But he's a pretty big following. And this guy like openly says he was radicalized in the Andrew Yang meme group. Like that's what started his journey. And that's why I think, especially for Zoomers, the fast-paced culture is not always a bad thing. I think what it depends really is whether you're just preaching to the choir, which can happen with leftist circles. It's like, I think you mentioned the Mark Fisher meme group. That's very much the case there. It's like, it's just people who already have like a certain politics who are just kind of, feeding into each other's own filter bubble. But I think the speed in which memes spread, if the content has some messages within it, it can be good because it can spread what normally takes a long time to learn just through memes. Like there's a thing in a lot of Marxist memes that they kind of say, why read Das Kapital when you can just learn through memes? And there's like all these, I'm not saying that's true, but like there's all these little memes kind of describing like Marxist things, like the falling rate of profit, commodity fetishism. And they show like the crisis of overproduction. There's this Bugs Bunny meme where it says, got not enough carrots, and it says too many carrots. And it like shows like these basic ideas with memes. Like there is that kind of potential to describe things that in a very simple way. Like for example, Marx, I disagree with this idea that everyone should read Capital, because a lot of his ideas, not all, are actually kind of common sense. Like they're easy to understand if you just take away the ideology, the neoliberal ideology that often blinds us from seeing it. But I think there are ways to communicate things in simple ways, and that's where I do see the value of memes. But I will add is that the memes can't really be top down. Like it never really works if it's the politician trying to make memes for themselves and their teams. It's always like a horizontalist endeavor where they kind of spread among like the supporters. So
I agree with you. I think that's very much the case. I think the attempts by the left to make a meme campaign that would rival the alt-right campaign of 2016 that may have helped Trump get into power. I actually don't know that even did help him that much, but this kind of notion that we need to do that, it always fails when it's organized by a formal campaign. It needs to be organic, growing up from other places. I mean, I do think that memes for sure are a great thing. I'm not saying let's get rid of memes. I think even, the terrible ones we have can function. Like I say, I mean, they're so deliberately cynical, a lot of the left memes, that they may kind of like, they may lead us to go and look elsewhere, as in...
Hey, yo, for some reason the recording just decided to cut off and I forgot to hit re-record. So unfortunately I'm going to have to stop the podcast right here, guys. I would definitely love to continue this conversation, and the rest of the conversation I had with Mike was actually super interesting, and I really wish that you guys could have heard all of it. But anyways, you will definitely hear Mike Watson come on this show again, and I will also be on his show on the Acid Left in a couple of weeks anyway. So at least this makes this episode a little bit shorter, and you will hear more of our conversations soon, I promise you.